10 years thrown away with a 2-line letter. He took not only her heart, but also every penny she had in the bank. The morning Evelyn discovered her entire life had been a lie, autumn frost still clung to the windows of the cottage she had called home for 10 years. Her hands trembled as she held the letter that would shatter everything she believed about love, trust, and the man who had shared her bed, her dreams, and her very soul. The words, "I cannot pretend anymore," seemed to burn through the parchment, each letter a dagger twisting deeper into her chest as she read them over and over, hoping they would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Marcus had vanished in the night like smoke, leaving behind only the cold scent of his cologne on the pillows and this devastating confession that spoke of deception spanning their entire relationship. The cottage felt hollow now, echoing with the ghost of conversations that had apparently meant nothing to him, filled with furniture they had chosen together and memories that now tasted bitter on her tongue. She pressed the letter against her heart, as if she could somehow absorb the pain and transform it into something manageable, but the ache only grew stronger, radiating through her entire being like poison. What Evelyn didn't know yet was that Marcus hadn't simply grown tired of their mortal love affair. He was bound to ancient laws that governed creatures like him, laws that demanded he choose between the human woman he cherished and the supernatural pack that had raised him from childhood. The letter spoke of pretense, but the truth was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Marcus was a shifter, bound by sacred oaths to the Shadow Moon Pack, and their leader had discovered his secret relationship with a human. The ultimatum had been brutal in its simplicity: abandon her or watch her die by pack law that forbade such unions. For 3 months after his disappearance, Evelyn existed in a haze of grief and bewilderment. She discovered that their shared bank account had been emptied not out of greed, but because Marcus had used every penny to purchase protective wards and charms from a traveling witch, desperate to shield her from the supernatural dangers that his world might bring to her doorstep. The cottage mortgage, transferred entirely to her name without her knowledge, had been his final act of love, ensuring she would have a home, even if he could never return to share it with her. During those long, lonely nights, Evelyn began to notice things she had previously dismissed as imagination. Shadows moved incorrectly across her walls, following patterns that defied the moonlight streaming through her windows. The wind carried whispers in languages she couldn't identify, and sometimes, in the depths of her dreams, she heard howling that seemed to call her name. Her reflection in mirrors occasionally showed golden flecks in her brown eyes that vanished the moment she looked directly at them, and her senses had become unnaturally sharp, picking up scents and sounds that should have been impossible for human perception. The village of Raven's Hollow had always been steeped in folklore and ancient traditions, nestled deep within the Thornwick Mountains, where mist clung to the valleys like living things, and the forests whispered secrets to those brave enough to listen. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the old families, the ones whose bloodlines stretched back to times when magic flowed openly through the world, and contracts with otherworldly beings shaped the very foundations of society. Evelyn had always assumed these were merely colorful stories passed down through generations, entertaining tales to intrigue tourists and add mystique to their remote corner of the world. Her own family history had been carefully hidden from her, protected by layers of memory charms and false documents that painted them as simple merchants and farmers. The truth was that the Thornwick line had once been among the most powerful witches in the region, bound by ancient pacts with the supernatural community that guaranteed protection in exchange for their services as mediators between the human and otherworldly realms. 3 generations ago, her great-grandmother had made a terrible mistake that resulted in the family's disgrace and exile from the supernatural community, their magical heritage suppressed, and their children raised ignorant of their true nature. The protective spells that had been woven into Evelyn's bloodline were beginning to weaken after decades of dormancy, and Marcus's presence in her life had inadvertently accelerated the process. Every kiss they had shared, every night they had spent intertwined in passion, had drawn more magic to the surface of her consciousness. His shifter nature had recognized the witch in her, even when her human mind remained oblivious, creating a bond between them that transcended simple mortal attraction. As autumn deepened into the harsh mountain winter, Evelyn's isolation became a crucible that forced her dormant abilities closer to the surface. She began to sense the emotional imprints left by previous occupants of the cottage, experiencing fragments of their joys and sorrows as if they were her own memories. The herb garden that she had always maintained with unusual success revealed itself to be enchanted, the plants responding to her moods and growing in impossible abundance despite the freezing temperatures. One particularly bitter evening, as snow began to fall in thick curtains that muffled all sound from the outside world, Evelyn made a discovery that would change the trajectory of her life forever. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage's cellar, wrapped in oiled leather and protected by preservation charms she couldn't yet identify, lay her great-grandmother's journal. The pages, filled with elegant script that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, chronicled decades of magical practice, supernatural negotiations, and the devastating consequences of the betrayal that had destroyed their family's standing in the hidden world. The journal revealed that the cottage itself had been built on a convergence of ley lines, making it a natural sanctuary for magical beings and a powerful focus for spellwork. Every renovation she and Marcus had made, every plant they had cultivated in the garden, every moment of love they had shared within these walls had contributed to reawakening the ancient protections that had lain dormant for generations. The timing of Marcus's departure was not coincidental, but precisely calculated by forces that understood the danger Evelyn's awakening powers might represent to the established supernatural order. As she read deeper into the journal, learning about her family's true history and the magnificent heritage that had been stolen from her, Evelyn felt a rage building in her chest that burned hotter than her grief. The Shadow Moon Pack had not simply taken Marcus away from her, they had perpetuated an injustice that stretched back 3 generations, ensuring that the Thornwick line remained powerless and ignorant of their rightful place in the magical community. Her great-grandmother's final entries spoke of a prophecy, a time when a Thornwick descendant would rise to reclaim their family's honor and reshape the balance of power that had held the supernatural world in stagnation for too long. The first sign that her magical inheritance was fully awakening came on the night of the winter solstice, when the boundaries between worlds grew thin and ancient magic flowed most freely through the ley lines beneath her cottage. Evelyn woke to find her bedroom filled with soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from her own skin, and every mirror in the house reflected not her familiar human appearance, but a more luminous version of herself, with silver threads woven through her dark hair and eyes that blazed with inner fire. The transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying, filling her with a sense of power she had never experienced, while simultaneously making her acutely aware of how much she still didn't understand about the world she was entering. The journal provided guidance, but 3 generations of separation from active magical practice had left gaps in knowledge that could prove dangerous if not addressed carefully. She needed a teacher, someone who understood both the old ways and the current state of supernatural politics, but finding such a person in her current state of isolation seemed impossible. The answer came from an unexpected source when a knock at her door interrupted her late-night study of the journal's more complex passages. Standing on her threshold, seeming to materialize out of the swirling snow like a figure from legend, was an elderly woman whose silver hair glowed with an inner light that matched Evelyn's own emerging radiance. Her eyes held the depth of centuries, and when she smiled, Evelyn felt recognition stir in her blood, an ancestral memory that whispered this stranger was actually family. "My dear child," the woman said, her voice carrying the musical quality that marked her as one of the old bloodlines. "I am Celeste Thornwick, your great-grandmother's sister, and I have been waiting a very long time for the magic to call me home to you." She stepped across the threshold without invitation, and Evelyn felt the cottage's protective wards recognize her presence and welcome her with a warmth that spoke of blood ties and shared heritage. "We have much work to do, and time is shorter than you know. The supernatural community has sensed your awakening, and not all of them will welcome the return of Thornwick power to the world." As Celeste settled into the cottage, as if she had always belonged there, Evelyn realized that her months of grief and isolation had not been an ending, but a preparation. The woman she had been, content to live a simple human life in ignorance of her true nature, had died the morning she found Marcus's letter. The woman she was becoming would be something far more dangerous and infinitely more powerful. Someone who could reshape the supernatural world's balance of power and perhaps, if she was strong enough and clever enough, find a way to reclaim the love that had been stolen from her by ancient laws and cruel traditions. But first, she would need to survive the attention her awakening had already drawn from entities that preferred the old order to remain unchanged, and the path ahead promised to be fraught with dangers that made heartbreak seem like a gentle summer rain compared to the storms that were coming. Celeste's first lesson came at dawn, when the cottage walls still hummed with residual energy from Evelyn's uncontrolled magical surge during the night. The older witch moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, her fingers trailing silver light as she reinforced protective wards that had been weakening for decades. "Your power called out across 3 mountain ranges last night," she said without preamble, her voice carrying a gravity that made Evelyn's stomach clench with anxiety. "Every supernatural creature within 100 miles now knows exactly where you are and what you're becoming." The implications hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She had spent months believing her isolation was keeping her safe, never realizing that her awakening magic was broadcasting her location like a beacon to every predator and power-hungry entity in the region. "How long do we have before they come?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, even as terror crawled up her spine like ice-cold fingers. "Some are already here," Celeste replied grimly, gesturing toward the frost-covered windows where shadows moved between the trees with too much purpose to be natural wildlife. "The Shadow Moon Pack arrived an hour before I did. They're maintaining their distance for now, but their alpha is growing impatient. He knows that allowing a Thornwick witch to reach full power could upset the careful balance he's spent decades establishing." Evelyn felt her newfound magic respond to her spike of anger, causing the air around her to shimmer with barely contained energy. The pack that had torn Marcus away from her was now circling her home like vultures, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate what they saw as a threat to their dominion. "Let them come," she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised them both. "I'm tired of running from shadows and hiding from truths that should have been mine from birth." Celeste studied her great niece with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of supernatural dynasties, recognizing something in Evelyn's bearing that spoke of the old Thornwick fire, the fierce pride that had once made their family both revered and feared throughout the magical community. "Your great-grandmother said something very similar just before she made the mistake that cost us everything," she warned softly. "Power without wisdom is destruction waiting to happen, child. Before you face what's coming, you need to understand the true scope of what was taken from our family and what forces we're truly dealing with." The history lesson that followed revealed layers of betrayal and manipulation that made Marcus's departure seem like a minor tragedy in comparison to the generational wounds that had been inflicted on the Thornwick line. 3 generations ago, Evelyn's great-grandmother Isadora had been the most gifted mediator the supernatural community had ever known, capable of negotiating peace between warring factions that had been locked in conflict for centuries. Her abilities had made her invaluable to the various councils and courts that governed the hidden world, but they had also made her dangerous to those who profited from chaos and division. The setup had been elaborate and devastating in its thoroughness. A false accusation of betraying supernatural secrets to human authorities had been supported by forged evidence and brought testimony from creatures whose debts made them vulnerable to coercion. The trial had been a mere formality, the verdict decided before the first witness spoke, and Isadora's exile had been swift and absolute. The protective spells cast on the family line had been meant to shield future generations from supernatural attention, but they had also cut them off from their magical heritage, leaving them defenseless and ignorant. The Blackthorn Covenant orchestrated it all, Celeste explained, her voice heavy with decades of suppressed rage. They're a shadow organization that operates behind the scenes, manipulating supernatural politics to maintain their own power base. They saw Isadora's influence as a threat to their agenda and eliminated her from the equation permanently. The Shadow Moon Pack was just one of many groups that benefited from her removal, gaining territory and influence that should have remained neutral under her mediation. As the morning progressed and Evelyn absorbed the staggering scope of the conspiracy that had shaped her family's fate, she began to understand that her personal tragedy was connected to something much larger and more sinister than she had imagined. Marcus's forced departure hadn't been just about pact law or forbidden love. It had been about preventing her awakening at a time when supernatural politics were shifting toward another period of potential conflict. The Covenant wanted the Thornwick line to remain powerless and irrelevant, ensuring that no one could challenge their behind-the-scenes manipulation of events. The first direct confrontation came sooner than expected, arriving in the form of an elegantly dressed woman who appeared at the cottage door just as Evelyn was beginning to grasp the basics of shielding her magical signature. The visitor's beauty was otherworldly in its perfection, but her eyes held a coldness that spoke of centuries spent viewing other beings as pawns in games they couldn't comprehend. Lady Ravenna Blackthorn, she introduced herself with a smile that never reached those ancient eyes. And I believe we have much to discuss. Celeste's reaction was immediate and violent, silver fire erupting from her fingertips as protective instincts honed over decades of exile flared to life. "You have no right to be here, serpent," she snarled, positioning herself between Evelyn and their uninvited guest. "The cottage stands on neutral ground, protected by laws even your covenant cannot ignore." Ravenna's laugh was like crystal breaking, beautiful and sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, but dear Celeste, those laws were written when Thornwick witches held real power. Your great-niece is nothing more than an untrained child, playing with forces she doesn't understand, hardly worthy of the protections her ancestors once enjoyed." Her gaze shifted to Evelyn, and the weight of that ancient attention made every nerve in the younger witch's body scream danger. "I've come to offer her a choice, the same choice we offered her great-grandmother so many years ago." The proposal was as elegant as it was devastating. Join the Covenant willingly, submit to magical bindings that would limit her power to acceptable levels, and in return, she would be allowed to live peacefully with a comfortable income, and the promise that those she loved would remain safe from supernatural interference. Refuse and face the consequences that had befallen every Thornwick witch who had dared to challenge the established order over the past 3 generations. "And Marcus?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest like magma seeking release. "What happens to him in this generous offer of yours?" Ravenna's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that seemed just slightly too sharp for human comfort. The shifter who dared to awaken your heritage. I'm afraid his fate was sealed the moment he chose love over loyalty to his pack. The Shadow Moon Alpha has been quite clear about the consequences of his disobedience, though I'm told the execution will be delayed until after your decision is made. Consider it additional motivation to choose wisely. The cottage's protective wards flared to brilliant life as Evelyn's magic responded to the threat against Marcus with overwhelming force. Windows rattled in their frames, and the very air seemed to catch fire as 3 generations of suppressed Thornwick power sought immediate and violent release. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Ravenna's perfect composure cracked, revealing genuine surprise at the raw magnitude of what she was witnessing. Fascinating, the Covenant representative murmured, her earlier mockery replaced by calculating interest. Perhaps you are more than just an untrained child after all. But power without control is merely destruction, little witch, and destruction serves no one's interests. You have 3 days to consider my offer before the consequences for your defiance begin to manifest in ways that will make your current heartbreak seem like paradise. After Ravenna's departure, the cottage fell into tense silence, broken only by the soft crackling of magical energy that continued to arc between Evelyn's fingers like captured lightning. Celeste began preparations for a protection ritual that would buy them time, but they both knew that 3 days would not be nearly enough to prepare for the forces gathering against them. The second night brought unexpected allies in the form of creatures that had once served the Thornwick line with fierce loyalty. A massive raven, with intelligence gleaming in its black eyes, perched on the windowsill, bearing messages from exiled members of the supernatural community who had suffered under Covenant rule. A pack of silver wolves materialized from the forest, their leader bearing scars that spoke of battles fought against overwhelming odds, offering their protection to the witch whose return might finally tip the balance toward justice. But it was the third visitor who changed everything, arriving just as the moon reached its zenith and Evelyn's magic sang with nocturnal power. He appeared at the edge of the cottage's protective circle like a figure stepped from shadow and starlight, tall and powerfully built, with eyes that held depths of sorrow she recognized from her own mirror. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of a man who had spent months screaming his anguish to empty skies. Evelyn. The single word held more pain and longing than entire poems had ever managed to convey, and she felt her carefully constructed walls crumble at the sound of Marcus speaking her name after so many months of silence. He stood just beyond the ward line, close enough to touch but separated by magical barriers that might as well have been continents. His shifter nature making every line of his body scream with the need to go to her, while supernatural law held him frozen in place. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words as she approached the barrier that kept them apart. Ravenna said the pack had condemned you, that refusing her offer would seal your execution. Marcus's smile was bitter as winter wind, carrying shadows of the battles he had fought and the prices he had paid for this moment of stolen time. "The Shadow Moon Pack did vote for my death," he confirmed, his eyes never leaving her face, as if memorizing every detail he had been forced to live without. "But they aren't the only pack in these mountains, and some debts run deeper than pack loyalty. I made bargains that will cost me everything I am, but they bought me enough time to warn you about what's really coming." The revelation that followed shattered every assumption Evelyn had made about her situation. The Covenant's ultimatum hadn't been the real threat. It had been a distraction designed to keep her focused on the wrong enemy while they prepared their true weapon. Hidden deep in the mountains was an ancient prison that had held the Thornwick family's most dangerous enemy for 3 generations, an entity whose power had once rivaled the gods themselves and whose hatred for their bloodline burned with the intensity of dying stars. "They're going to release the Void King," Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if speaking the name too loudly might draw the creature's attention across impossible distances. Your great-grandmother didn't just mediate disputes between supernatural factions. She was the key component in the binding that holds him in his prison. Her exile weakened the seal, and your awakening has given them the final piece they need to break it completely. The true scope of the Covenant's plan became clear with horrible clarity. They didn't want to control Evelyn's power. They wanted to corrupt it, to turn the Thornwick magic that had once protected the world into the very key that would unlock the door to apocalyptic destruction. The 3-day deadline wasn't about her decision. It was about the time they needed to complete the ritual that would transform her into an unwilling catalyst for unleashing ancient evil upon the world. "There's still hope," Marcus said urgently, his fingers pressed against the barrier that separated them, as if he could somehow bridge the gap through force of will alone. "But it requires everything we both swore we'd never risk again. There's a mating bond, an ancient ritual that could combine our natures and amplify your power beyond anything the Covenant expects. But the cost..." He trailed off, unable to voice the terrible price that such desperate magic would demand. Celeste, who had been listening from the shadows with growing horror, stepped forward with her face set in lines of grim determination. "The blood bond ritual," she said quietly, recognizing what Marcus was proposing. "It hasn't been attempted in over 2 centuries because the failure rate is absolute. Success means power beyond imagination, but failure means the complete destruction of both souls involved. There would be no second chances, no recovery, no existence beyond the moment of failure." Standing there in the moonlight with Marcus so close, she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Feeling the weight of generations of injustice and the threat of impending catastrophe pressing down upon her shoulders, Evelyn made the decision that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the supernatural world itself. But what that decision would be, and whether love or duty would ultimately triumph, remained balanced on the knife's edge of destiny as the first of the 3 days began to slip away into darkness. The blood bond ritual required a convergence of elements that seemed designed by fate itself to test every ounce of courage Evelyn possessed. As dawn broke on the 2nd day, she stood in the cottage's cellar where the ley lines pulsed strongest beneath the earth, surrounded by ancient symbols that Celeste had spent the night carving into the stone walls with silver fire. The air thrummed with power so intense it made her teeth ache, and every breath felt like inhaling lightning. Marcus paced the protective circle's perimeter like a caged wolf, his human form barely containing the beast that clawed for release beneath his skin. The transformation he would need to undergo for the ritual wasn't the simple shift between man and wolf that his pack nature allowed. It was something far more primal and dangerous, a return to the original form that existed before supernatural politics divided the world into neat categories of species and hierarchy. "Once we begin, there's no turning back," Celeste warned for the 3rd time, her ancient eyes reflecting centuries of wisdom and regret. "The ritual will either forge you into something new and powerful beyond imagination, or it will consume you both completely. Your souls will be tested by forces that predate civilization itself, and only perfect trust in each other will see you through to the other side." Evelyn felt the weight of that truth settle into her bones like cold stone. Perfect trust, the very thing that Marcus's deception had shattered, was now the only thing that could save them both. She looked into his eyes across the barrier that still separated them, seeing her own fear and desperate hope reflected in those dark depths. "Are you ready to trust me with everything you are?" she asked him, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling in her chest. His answer came without hesitation, carrying the conviction of a man who had already lost everything once and refused to let fear steal his second chance. "I trusted you with my heart when I thought I was only human. Now, I'm ready to trust you with my soul," He pressed his palm against the barrier, and Evelyn matched the gesture from her side, feeling the magic that separated them recognize their unity and begin to weaken in response. The first phase of the ritual required the dismantling of every protection and shield that surrounded them, leaving them vulnerable to any force that might wish them harm. As the cottage's ancient wards fell one by one, supernatural predators began to emerge from the forest in numbers that turned the landscape into a living nightmare. The Shadow Moon Pack howled their rage from the tree line, while creatures of shadow and fang prowled closer with each passing moment, drawn by the scent of exposed magic and the promise of unprecedented power. But the most terrifying presence remained unseen, a psychic pressure that pressed against the boundaries of reality itself as something vast and malevolent stirred in its ancient prison. The Void King could sense the ritual beginning, could feel the potential for the very power that had once bound him to be turned toward his liberation, and his anticipation rolled across the mountains like a tide of living darkness that made every supernatural creature for miles tremble with instinctive terror. "He's trying to influence the ritual," Celeste gasped, silver blood running from her nose as she fought to maintain her concentration against the entity's psychic assault. "If he can corrupt the bond at the moment of formation, he can use your connection to Marcus as a gateway into this reality. We have to move faster than planned." The acceleration of the ritual's pace meant abandoning several safety measures that Celeste had insisted were crucial for survival. Evelyn felt the magic building around them reach dangerous levels as Marcus finally crossed the fallen barrier and took her hands in his, their skin burning where they touched as supernatural energies sought to tear them apart or forge them together with equal violence. The moment their blood mingled on the ritual blade, reality exploded into chaos that defied every law of physics and magic Evelyn thought she understood. She found herself experiencing Marcus's memories as if they were her own, feeling the agony of his forced transformation as a child when the pack had claimed him, understanding for the first time the depth of sacrifice he had made in walking away from her to keep her safe. His wolf spirit rose to meet her witch magic, and the collision between their supernatural natures created something entirely new, a fusion of power that had never existed before in the recorded history of their world. But the Void King was waiting for that moment of vulnerability, striking at the instant when their defenses were down and their consciousnesses intertwined. His presence flooded through their connection like poison, seeking to corrupt the bond from within and transform their love into the key that would unlock his prison. Evelyn felt his hatred pour into her mind. 3 generations of rage at the Thornwick line focused into a psychic weapon designed to drive her insane with guilt and despair. The visions he forced upon her were devastating in their cruelty. She saw her great-grandmother's final moments, watched Isadora die alone and heartbroken in exile, while believing her family would be forever cursed because of her failures. She experienced every moment of pain that Marcus had endured during their separation, felt his wolf spirit slowly dying from grief while he fought battles against creatures that wanted to use him as a weapon against her. She witnessed possible futures where their ritual failed and the world burned in supernatural fire, where every person she had ever loved paid the ultimate price for her hubris in believing she could challenge forces beyond her comprehension. Marcus fought beside her in that psychic battlefield, his wolf nature providing strength and clarity that her human consciousness couldn't match. Together, they pushed back against the Void King's assault, but the entity's power was growing stronger with each passing second as his followers completed their own ritual in the mountain depths. The prison that had held him for 3 generations was beginning to crack, and soon he would be free regardless of whether he could corrupt their bond. The turning point came when Evelyn realized that the Void King's greatest weakness was also his greatest strength. His hatred for the Thornwick line was so absolute, so consuming that it had become the core of his identity during his long imprisonment. That hatred was what sustained him, what gave him power, but it was also what made him predictable. Instead of fighting against his assault, she opened herself completely to it, drawing his malevolence into the ritual circle where Celeste's ancient protections could transform it into something else entirely. "You want to destroy the Thornwick legacy?" Evelyn spoke directly into the psychic storm, her voice carrying across impossible distances to reach the entity in his crumbling prison. "Then face what we've truly become." She and Marcus reached the final phase of their bonding at the same moment, their merged consciousness blazing with combined power that dwarfed anything either species had achieved alone. The transformation was beyond anything the old texts had described. Evelyn felt her witch magic evolve beyond simple spellcasting into something that could reshape reality at its most fundamental level, while Marcus's wolf nature expanded into a primal force that connected him to every aspect of the natural world. Together, they became living proof that the ancient laws separating supernatural species were artificial constructs designed to limit power rather than necessary boundaries imposed by nature. Their combined might struck the Void King's psychic assault like lightning hitting a mountain, shattering his connection to their ritual and sending shockwaves through the prison that held him. But instead of simply repelling his attack, their bond had done something far more significant. They had absorbed his hatred and transformed it into understanding, taken his rage and alchemized it into wisdom, creating a psychic feedback loop that began to unravel the very foundations of his power. The revelation that followed was staggering in its implications. The Void King had never been a separate entity at all, but rather the collective shadow of the supernatural community itself, born from centuries of prejudice, fear, and the deliberate separation of natural allies into competing factions. The Blackthorn Covenant hadn't been trying to release an ancient enemy. They had been feeding and strengthening the manifestation of their own worst impulses, creating a monster from their determination to maintain power through division and conflict. Every time they prevented cooperation between species, every act of prejudice and manipulation, they made him stronger. Celeste breathed, her eyes wide with understanding as the truth became clear. The prison wasn't holding him in, it was holding us apart. Isadora didn't bind an enemy. She created a sanctuary where he could grow in power while the supernatural world forgot how to work together. The final battle wasn't fought with claws and fangs or fire and lightning, but with the simple act of connection itself. As word of Evelyn and Marcus's successful bonding spread through the supernatural community, other beings began to remember what they had lost in generations of enforced separation. Witches reached out to vampires who had once been their allies. Shapeshifters remembered the ancient pacts that had bound them to Fey courts. And slowly but inexorably, the network of cooperation that had once protected their world began to reform. With each new connection, each act of trust between former enemies, the Void King's power diminished. He had been sustained by isolation and fear, but unity and understanding were antithetical to his very existence. The psychic screams that echoed from his dissolving prison could be heard across 3 mountain ranges as the manifestation of supernatural prejudice began to tear itself apart. Ravenna Blackthorn arrived at the cottage just as the entity's death throes shook the earth beneath their feet, her perfect composure finally cracking to reveal the panic beneath. "You don't understand what you've done," she snarled at Evelyn, her ancient beauty beginning to fade as the power she had drawn from the Void King's influence started to abandon her. Without the proper hierarchies, without the natural order that keeps the dangerous ones contained, the world will tear itself apart. The only thing that was unnatural was the barriers you created to maintain your own power, Evelyn replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had looked into the heart of evil and emerged stronger for the experience. Marcus stood beside her, their bond now visible as silver threads that connected not just to each other, but to every supernatural being that chose cooperation over conflict. The real order is what we're building now, together. The Covenant's collapse was swift and decisive once their source of power was gone. Supernatural beings who had spent generations living in fear of their authority suddenly found the courage to speak truth about centuries of manipulation and oppression. The evidence of their crimes poured forth like water from a broken dam, and the new councils that formed to replace them were built on principles of representation and cooperation rather than fear and control. Marcus's pack welcomed him back, not as a traitor who had broken their laws, but as a pioneer who had discovered a new evolution of their species. The Shadow Moon Alpha, freed from the psychic influence that had poisoned his judgment for decades, publicly acknowledged that the old restrictions on interspecies relationships had been tools of oppression rather than protection. Other packs followed suit, recognizing that diversity and connection made them stronger rather than weaker. The cottage that had once been Evelyn's prison of grief became the foundation for something unprecedented in supernatural history. As beings from across the magical world came to learn about the bonding ritual and the new possibilities it represented, the small building expanded through spatial magic into a complex that could house representatives from every species and faction. The Thornwick Institute, as it came to be known, became the first truly integrated supernatural community in over 1,000 years. 1 year after the morning that had changed everything, Evelyn stood in the same kitchen where she had once held Marcus's farewell letter. But now the space hummed with life and purpose. The cottage was filled with the sounds of different languages and species working together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. Through the windows, she could see wolves playing with fey children, while witches and vampires shared knowledge that had been kept separate for generations. Marcus found her there as the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, his arms encircling her from behind as their bond sang with contentment that neither had believed possible during those dark months of separation. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear as he held her close. Evelyn leaned back into his embrace, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her spine and the warm glow of their connection that linked them to an ever-expanding network of supernatural beings who had chosen love over fear. "Only that it took us so long to realize what we were truly capable of," she replied, turning in his arms to meet his eyes with a smile that held all the joy and hope their bond had made possible. The woman who had woken up that autumn morning to find her life in ruins had discovered something far more precious than the simple human happiness she had lost. She had found her true nature, her real family, and a love that transcended every boundary the world had tried to build between them. The cottage's walls might have contained her grief for a season, but they could never have held the magnitude of what she and Marcus had built together, a legacy that would reshape the supernatural world for generations to come.